First, my sincere welcome to the first Research and Hope Day that's sponsored by the Cancer Connection, Idaho. My name is Luana Lampkin, and I'm the proud chairman of the board of the Cancer Connection, Idaho. I'll introduce you to the rest of the board in just a few minutes. We had hoped to attract as many as 200 people this evening, thinking that this was our first event, and gosh, if we got 200, we'd be thrilled. We started saying to people we could not accommodate them at 480. So, and even on a cold night like this, you have found your way here. So we thank you very much for your support. It's also very confirming for those of us who have been working toward the Cancer Connection that there is a need in Treasure Valley for this kind of education. The Cancer Connection is a new not-for-profit organization in our community. Our goal is to make sure that anyone who is touched by cancer has an opportunity to connect with other people, to have education, and to find the kind of support they want that is non-medical. All of our medical institutions in this community do a wonderful job of providing medicine. We don't need to be doing that. But they can't do everything they'd like to do for patients and families and others who are touched by cancer. So that is our goal, to provide those kind of free services, just as we've provided you a free educational program this evening. And to do it, we know we need three things. We need absolutely, totally crazy, committed people. And I think we found about 400 tonight. We also have nearly 60 professionals in the community that have signed up to be our ambassadors and to explain to patients who we are and to recommend that they seek out our services. We also need great programs. We have enough planned from our program committee to last months, so we're ready to get going. The final thing we need is a home, and we need a place that is warm and friendly and makes you and a lot of other people want to walk in the front door and sit down and have a cup of tea and a chat, or come to a lecture, or learn how to cook healthy, or do lots of other things. So that's where we are right now. We have been raising funds for a little less than a year. We have $117,000 in cash, and I see a lot of our donors out there tonight, and we thank you very much. We need $285,000 to open our doors, so we hope that you might consider this evening making a donation on the way out the door. But regardless, we're glad to have you here. I want to draw your attention to this slide that you see up here. We've had lots of wonderful people that have helped us put this together this evening. Not only all of those donors, but also I want you to meet our board members. And I'm going to read their names. I'd like for the board members to stand up and wave your hands or something, but I know there's somebody here that you're going to want to cheer for, but save it, and we'll wait until you get to meet all of them. Tori Goldtree, Jennifer Gatto, Sharon Katz, Carl Keeler, Mike Ling, Amy Morin, Deborah Molnick, Susan Smith, Scott Summerlin, Michelle Tay, Beth Toll, Sally Zive, and finally, I really want to thank our event coordinator, our volunteer event coordinator, who is Elizabeth Clark. We have no staff at the Cancer Connection, and so the names that I just called are the people who do the work every day, and they do a fabulous job. I want to say thanks to the folks in the back who are doing the videotaping. These are the University Television Productions from Boise State, and they're making the video available. You'll be able to see it or tell your friends that they can see it by checking our website, where we'll have a link. And it looks as if they are also going to be able to show it on our local public television station. So we'll look forward to that. When you sat down, you got a bunch of little things on your chair. One of them was a card and a pencil, and we hope that you will write down questions that you have for Dr. Cohen while he's speaking. And then in 40 minutes or so, people will come through the aisles waving cards, and that's your sign to pass those to the aisle. We'll present those to Dr. Cohen and try to get as many questions answered as possible. We'll probably restrict that to general questions. If you have a personal health question, those probably will not be able to be answered this evening. And now, I know one thing I neglected to mention, and that is the restrooms are out this door. There's a few stairs down, but it's also possible to get there by elevator. If we have anyone who's in a wheelchair, your safety is particularly important to us, and if you or your companion need any help, you can get some right out here. I think that's all the little housekeeping things I need to do. Now I want to introduce you to Deborah Mulnick. Deborah is a board member, and she's also the chairman of our program committee, and she's the one, she and Sharon Katz, who said, we've got to get Dr. Cohen here. So I'm going to let Deborah tell you about him.
Wow. It's great to see all of you turn out tonight. Sorry. It's great that you're all here tonight. We're really pleased to have you. About a year and a half ago, I learned that Dr. Cohen was coming to speak in Sun Valley at the Wellness Festival. And I knew of his work through publications about using yoga and other mind-body practices with women who had breast cancer. And I was very interested in hosting him for dinner. I got his email address. He didn't know me, and I contacted him and said, would you be willing to come to a dinner hosted by a bunch of strangers? And he graciously accepted, and the rest is history. After meeting him and hearing him present, the idea for this Cancer Connection was formed, and here we are tonight. So it's really exciting to have you all. Dr. Cohen is professor and director of the Integrative Medicine Program at the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center and distinguished clinical professor, Fudan University Cancer Hospital in Shanghai, China. Dr. Cohen is a founding member and past president of the International Society for Integrative Oncology. He's conducted a number of NIH-funded clinical trials examining the effects of contemplative mind-body practices aimed at reducing the negative effects of treatment and improving quality of life. He's interested in examining different types of complementary programs that can be easily incorporated into conventional treatment. It's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Cohen back to Idaho for his second time.
Thank you, Deborah. It's a real pleasure to be here and back in Idaho. The last time I was here, I was enjoying the summer weather. So this is, when I hear people from Idaho saying it's cold, then I know it's not just my thin Texas blood. It's really cold out there tonight. So I thank all of you for coming out on this chilly evening. I am particularly thankful for Deborah for putting all this together into this wonderful organization that you have now in Boise called the Cancer Connection, which will be, once they are fully launched and have a home, as you heard, really an invaluable service. And I'll share with you tonight some of the information that will give you even more knowledge behind how critically important this type of organization is. Don't want this distracting me from this side of the stage. So what I'm going to be talking about is what I'm calling living the anti-cancer life. There's a wonderful book published by the late David Servan Schreiber called AntiCancer, A New Way of Life. And within this talk, I'll be touching on some of the information that he puts forward in this book and taking it, let's say, one step further in trying to motivate people to actually engage and live this anti-cancer life. Why this is so important is we're really at a unique time in our world where for the first time ever, cancer has become the #1 killer. For decades, it has always been cardiovascular disease, but now cancer has surpassed that. We all, very importantly, need to know that we carry cancer cells in us. At any given time, we have mutating cells in our body that hopefully our body can recognize and control either through our immune system or through something that's called apoptosis, which is spontaneous cell death. Cells that are mutated should not continue to multiply. And of course, if cells that are mutated continue to multiply unchecked, that can lead to cancer. And so it's important to try and keep our bodies as healthy as possible so that we can keep this inappropriate growth under control. We are also all being exposed to different cancer-promoting things in our environment. This can be toxins, this can be the air that we breathe, this can be flying at 35,000 feet in an airplane when you're getting exposure to radiation. But again, there are things to help keep things in check. And the most frightening thing that everyone needs to realize is that now in the United States, 1 in 2 men and 1 in 3 women will get cancer in their lifetime. And this is really a staggering statistic, and the numbers are actually getting worse. We're making progress in what is called the war against cancer in terms of improving survival for those who are diagnosed with cancer. But we're not having a lot of progress in decreasing the incidence in the first place. And in fact, if you start looking around the world, the most disturbing statistics come from the developing world, where the incidence of cancer is rising at a dramatic rate. So one of the questions that arises is, why are we starting to see these differential rates in terms of incidence of cancer? This is some data that the World Health Organization put together now a number of years ago, and was looking at the distribution of breast cancer around the world. And you could superimpose prostate cancer or colon cancer on this same world map, and there would be similar statistics where we see that the highest incidence of breast cancer is in North America. In Western Europe, we see here in South America, Argentina, Australia, New Zealand. In the Middle East, there's a little dot that's hard to see, which is Israel. And so these are all what one could argue are Western-based countries. And in fact, when they were collecting the data from parts of rural China, they couldn't find a single individual who had breast cancer across any generation. Now, in the United States, you could go to a small town of 5,000 people. You could probably go to a small town of 1,500 people, and it would be impossible to not find somebody who is somehow touched by breast cancer. This is really a ubiquitous disease, and I would fathom that there probably isn't anyone in this room who hasn't somehow been touched by breast cancer, either themselves or a family member or a coworker, a friend, etc. And so, of course, one of the questions that comes up is why? Why are there so few women with breast cancer in rural China, yet in North America, it's one per every 100,000 women. And when I first started doing work in China, I've been working with colleagues in traditional Chinese medicine in Shanghai for over 10 years now. We started talking about what cancers should we be investigating. And from my understanding and seeing these types of statistics, to me the main cancers that we would focus on would be liver cancer or stomach cancer or lung cancer, the ones that have the highest incidence in China. And I literally made the comment, well, we shouldn't be studying breast cancer because it's such a low incidence here, and we should study things that are uniquely different. And the head of the cancer hospital said, oh, no. The #1 cancer for women in Shanghai is breast cancer. The #1 cancer for women in Mumbai, India is breast cancer. And to me, that was mind-boggling because, again, I'd looked at these maps, I'd understood these statistics, and he said that it is in the urban centers that now breast cancer has become the #1 cancer for women. And so I said, well, what do you think's going on? This is really an interesting epidemiological question. In essentially one generation of women, we all of a sudden have these staggering rates of breast cancer. And he had one answer: Western lifestyle. And this is a physician who is trained in Western medicine. He's trained at MD Anderson. And he literally said Western lifestyle, that the food that they're eating has changed. They're eating processed food. They're eating fast food. They have sedentary behavior. And they have a lot more stress in their lives than they ever have before. And so what I'm going to talk about this evening is this area of cancer prevention and control, and put out some information to you specifically around these areas of nutrition, sedentary behavior, obesity, the role that stress can play. And I'm actually not going to be talking about chemical exposure, although there is a lot more information evolving now on the role that chemical exposures can have, things like the BPAs in plastic, things like putting hot beverages into styrofoam, putting plastic into a microwave, and essentially creating toxins in that fashion. The top things on this slide, physical activity, nutrition, and how we manage stress in our lives, are things that we really have much more control over. And so we, with our patients at MD Anderson, really try and focus in this area. So let me share with you some information about this area of nutrition and things that have really changed in the past 50 years or so. And here you can see some data on the change in our exposure to and consumption of sugar in our diet. And this data ended in around collection in around the 1970s, where it was estimated around 70 kilograms or so per family. Per individual per year in the United States. Just last week I saw a report from the USDA that estimated that the average consumption of added sugar in an American's diet is 153 pounds a year. That would be the equivalent of filling up 5 grocery store shelves with 1-pound bags of sugar. An average of more than 25 teaspoons a day of added sugar into your diet. So this isn't talking about sugar that you would get from a glass of orange juice or from a baked potato, but literally sugar that's added into our diet. Well, why is this a problem? Here's an example of the relationship between glycemic load. So now we're not just talking about added sugar, but having a diet that will really spike your glucose levels and will leading to an increase in insulin and the risk of developing ER-positive breast cancer, which is the most common kind of breast cancer. And women who have the highest glycemic load have an increased risk of developing cancer. If we shift and look at the #2 killer worldwide, we see a relationship between added sweeteners in our diet and changing cardiovascular disease-related markers. So here we can see on the far left the percent of total energy from added sugars. So again, an average of 27 teaspoons a day of added sugars into the diet, and a direct relationship with HDL levels, where we see that as added sugars go up, HDL levels go down. And in particular, we see for women, LDL levels going up as added sugars in the diet goes up. We have pharmaceutical companies spending tens of millions of dollars on drugs to modify these two factors in the blood, HDL and LDL. And we have individuals consuming mass amounts of pharmaceutical agents to modify these two aspects of our blood functioning. And it could be as simple as removing the 25 teaspoons of sugar that are in our diet to modify these things. Now, to me, this was really news, because cardiovascular disease, from my perspective in education, was really looking at fat and looking at saturated fats in our food and cholesterol, etc. Now there's a much clearer understanding that sugar could be a culprit in this as well. Well, this, as well as a lot of other data looking at sugar and the role of sugar in our health, led Robert Lustig and colleagues to write a very provocative piece that they published in the journal Nature, which is one of the top medical journals. And they're suggesting that we need to think about sugar and controlling sugar the same way that we control tobacco and alcohol. They lay out a lot of convincing evidence in this short piece that attributes the same amount of danger to our health from sugar as it is from tobacco and alcohol. And I'm guessing that a lot of people in this audience, as was the case for me, would never equate sugar with tobacco. But some of the evidence is really, really quite compelling. Now, cancer, as well as cardiovascular disease, as well as Alzheimer's, are what we call inflammatory diseases. And Alzheimer's disease is now recently being called type 3 diabetes, a clear link between, again, cumulative sugar consumption and sugar exposure and risk of developing this form of dementia. So you may wonder, how can you possibly consume 27 teaspoons of sugar a day and not know about it? A lot of people in this audience are probably careful. They read labels, and you may read the label of something that seems like it's healthy, like a granola bar. But if you don't start really reading the fine print, then a lot of the information may get lost. And all companies, food companies, have to, of course, put the ingredients, list all the ingredients, and they list them preferentially in the order of the quantity of that particular ingredient. But when you start looking at the details here, so here we see some brown sugar, and here's some more sugar that's part of the rice that's in this, and then there's some corn syrup, and then they throw in some more sugar that's part of the rice crisp that's in here. And then there's a little more sugar that's part of the cookie pieces. And then they just throw in some sugar that's not part of anything else that's in there. And then they throw in some corn syrup solids. And then they throw in inverted sugar, whatever inverted sugar is. Maybe they didn't really need to invert the sugar, since there's enough sugar so far in this product. Then there's fructose, and then there's molasses. This is the healthy snack for our children, the granola bar. So it is embedded in all these different products that are out there, even, again, the ones that we think are healthy. Soda pop, we know that there's 12, 13 teaspoons of sugar in every soda that one consumes. But a granola bar, you would never think is something that's unhealthy. So it's really important to be looking at the labels to try and decrease exposure to sugar. So another big change in our society within our diet is the exposure to kinds of fats that are in our foods. Soy oil is a ubiquitous product that is in almost all fast food and all processed food. Soy oil is very cheap. Soy oil is inflammatory in nature because it is essentially an omega-6 fatty acid. Omega-6 fatty acids are an essential fatty acid, meaning that they are essential for us to survive. We need to have omega-6 fatty acids, but we need to have them in the right balance. And everyone, of course, has heard of omega-3 fatty acids, which are viewed as a healthy fatty acid or anti-inflammatory in nature. Well, omega-6s are inflammatory in nature. And when we get too much of something that's inflammatory in our body, it causes inflammation. This slide shows you the relationship between omega-6 load. As omega-6 load goes up, risk of breast cancer goes up. This is specifically for advanced breast cancer, but more than 2 times the risk of advanced breast cancer for women who fall into the highest category of omega-6 load. Something that is quite tragic is the transformation of the food that we're eating due to change in agricultural practices since the 1960s. And this graph represents that specific change as it relates to the balance between omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids. Remembering that omega-6 cause inflammation, omega-3s help to control inflammation. So 4 very common products, butter, pork, beef, and eggs, we see that back in the 1960s, even something like butter looked like a health food, where you have this very healthy ratio of a 2-to-1. Eggs, 2-to-1 ratio of 6-to-3. But what happens in the year 2000 is that ratio has become very imbalanced towards high in omega-6. And this has to do with how we raise animals in our country. And beef, for example, cattle tend to not eat a lot of grass anymore because cows that are only eating grass tend to be skinnier cows. If you feed that same cow corn or soy, they become really fat, but they also become loaded with omega-6 fatty acid. So we end up causing inflammation in the animals, and then we end up eating these animals that are sick and have this tremendous inflammatory load in their flesh. And something that's very provocative to think about is looking at this from an evolutionary perspective in terms of our diet and the change in our diet. And if we consider how long human beings have been on this planet to be 1 hour, so 60 minutes, we have been on this planet as a metaphor. 58.5 of those minutes, we were hunter-gatherers. So for 58.5 of the 60 minutes of us being on this planet, we were foraging for our food, hunting for our food. We were physically moving around a lot. And we weren't raising food, certainly in the way that started once we developed cities and developed agriculture. We definitely weren't interacting with food for the 58.5 minutes of what we've been doing since the Industrial Revolution. So for only 1.5 minutes of our existence on this planet, for 60 minutes, have we been an agricultural society. And this represents the increase in coronary artery disease, and you could superimpose cancer on this same graph. Well, around the time just before the Industrial Revolution, we start to see a dramatic increase in total fat, in saturated fat. But you notice here, N6 and N3, this is omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids. So we see this precipitous increase in omega-6 fatty acid and a decrease in omega-3 fatty acid in our diet. And this has happened in a fraction of a minute of our existence on the 60 minutes of being on this planet. In such a short period of time, this huge change in what we're putting into our bodies, and the pressure that this is putting on our genome, on our genes, and a lot of the chronic diseases that we're starting to experience that we're exporting from this country to the rest of the world. So this imbalance is really something that is problematic. And we know this in our society more than any others, with the increase in the epidemic of obesity, but this is something now that is being exported to other countries. The #1 diabetes capital of the world is now India. And a lot of Eastern countries are starting to have problems with obesity, and again, a lot of these diseases that they never had before. Well, to give you a little perspective on this, I'll run you through what's happened in this country dating back to 1990 as it pertains specifically to obesity. These are slides from the Center for Disease Control, which represents each state with different colors based on the percent of that state that would be classified as obese. And this essentially means a body mass index of greater or equal to 30, which is equivalent to somebody around 5'4" being 30 pounds overweight. And so back in 1990, the states that were in the darkest blue was 10 to 14% within that state classified as obese. A new category of 15 to 20%. A new category of greater than 20% being obese in that state. In 2001, greater than 25% represented by that new color. 2005, greater than 30% of that state being classified as obese. And in 2009, there's still the one holdout, Colorado, that's below 20%. Well, then 2010, they no longer have that honor, and more than 25%, closer to 30% of the US being classified as obese. There's a clear trajectory of the direction that the United States is going. If you were to look at overweight within this category, so a BMI of 25 or above, more than 60% of the US population falls into that category now. If we look at children, a third of our children are obese or overweight. And so this is something that is quite a calamity and needs to be managed. Now, why this is really relevant in cancer is starting to become much more apparent. But this is data published in the New England Journal of Medicine, one of the top medical journals, showing a clear relationship between obesity and mortality from cancer. For all cancers combined, for women, for men, the rate being 1.6, so a greater than 30% risk of death for people who are obese. And for some cancers, of course, the rate is even higher. For women, the overall risk being 1.8, and for breast cancer, a more than doubling of the risk of death for individuals who are classified as obese. Now, you would think that this is as simple as saying to individuals, you just need to eat less food, you need to eat healthier food, and just get out there and be more physically active. And that will have a dramatic effect. But it turns out that it's not that simple. And I stumbled across this research that was published last year in the journal Nature, one of the top scientific journals, where they were trying to follow up on some observational data that found a relationship between antibiotic use and the development of obesity. And that sounds very strange, for why would there be a relationship between taking antibiotics and later development of obesity? But there's this whole new field investigating what's called the microbiome. And the microbiome is essentially what's going on in our gut. And it turns out that the health of our gut is extremely important for many systems of the body, not the least of which is our immune system. And it turns out aspects of course, digestion and what the downstream implications are. And in this very elegant, simple study, what they did is they took a group of mice, exposed them to a standard dose of antibiotics that you would use if you had strep throat or if you had a sinus infection, and compared them to a group of mice that weren't exposed to any antibiotics. And here you see a picture of the mouse not exposed to antibiotics, and here you see the mouse exposed to antibiotics. Both animals consumed the exact same diet, the exact caloric intake. It was identical, but the animals exposed to the antibiotics became obese. They gained weight. They had more adipose tissue. So the situation is complex. And before you leave tonight, you'll have a little quiz that you have to complete based on this slide. So I'll leave it up for a while so you can pay attention. But this just represents that it's not as simple as energy in, energy out. It's much, much more complex than that. However, we shouldn't forget the simplicity of it is also always going to be the first start. But luckily, there are a lot of people at work on this. And for example, I believe the European Union shortly is going to be looking at approving probiotics as an added component to help people who are struggling with losing weight, essentially making sure the gut is healthy, because you could be decreasing your caloric intake, but if the body isn't processing the food properly, it may be going to fat instead of to healthier metabolism. So the good news in all of this bad news that I just shared with you is that we know that the majority of cancer could be prevented if people made appropriate lifestyle choices. I don't even have on this slide tobacco, which we know accounts for 30 to 35% of cancers on this planet. 30 to 35% of cancers would disappear if tobacco didn't exist. That, of course, is a number that does not need to be emphasized. Nutrition, sedentary behavior, obesity accounts for close to 35% of cancers. And then still somewhat unknown is the role of stress in social support. But as I'll show you, we know that stress can impact every single system in our body, damaging our immune system, damaging cellular function, etc. So both the American Institute for Cancer Research and the American Cancer Society have come out with a very strong statement that we can prevent at least a third of most of the common cancers if people had appropriate diet, exercised regularly, and maintained a healthy weight. And for some cancers, the number, the percent that could be prevented is very high, as you see here for endometrial cancer, 70%. 38% of breast cancers could be prevented. 50% of colorectal cancers could be prevented with 3 simple lifestyle changes. So this leads us really to this field of integrative medicine. And at MD Anderson, we have this wonderful program. We have some information. We have a newsletter over there that describes a little bit about our program. But what I'll do is walk you through some of what we do in the areas of education, clinical care, and research. In terms of education, this is a wonderful resource for all of you and for healthcare professionals to learn about when you're diagnosed with cancer. There's a lot of stress, there's a lot of uncertainty, you get a lot of misinformation. And this is a wonderful resource where you can go and look at reviews of different therapies. We partner with Natural Medicine Comprehensive Database, where they review over 1,000 different herbs and supplements, because everyone is told, well, you need to go and take this herb, and if you take this antioxidant, it'll improve your outcomes. Well, this is a group that does definitive reviews on the risks, on the benefits, on drug-herb interactions, etc. We have wonderful multimedia component that gives you access to lectures on different topics within integrative medicine, as well as videos that could be downloaded and viewed on teaching people about yoga, teaching people about self-massage, different meditation programs, etc. So I encourage, for those of you touched by cancer and who just want to learn more about a particular herb or supplement, this is a wonderful resource. We also put on conferences, both for healthcare professionals, as you see pictured here, next month, to be able to teach healthcare professionals about this field and how to talk to patients about integrative medicine so they can learn some of the evidence within this area, as well as working with acupuncturists, massage therapists, yoga teachers to teach them about cancer and how to safely work with cancer patients. For our clinical model, Dr. Richard Lee, who's the medical oncologist directing our center, we follow the biomedical model that George Engel published back in the 70s in the journal Science, where health is more than just physical well-being, but also psychospiritual and social well-being. And so in terms of physical well-being within the conventional side of the hospital, we're looking at chemotherapy, surgery, radiation, and pharmacological interventions as necessary. And all of this is the first and very important arsenal in the battle against cancer. But when we talk about physical well-being, we're talking about nutrition, we're talking about exercise, we're talking about the appropriate incorporation of complementary treatments like acupuncture or massage for symptom control. In the area of psychospiritual well-being, working with our colleagues in psychiatry and psychology, and then incorporating appropriate complementary treatments like yoga or Tai Chi or Qigong, these movement-based mind-body practices to help relieve the stress the patients are experiencing. And probably the most underappreciated area of social well-being, making sure that patients are appropriately socially integrated to be able to foster the best from each individual. And this is working with our colleagues in patient advocacy, social work, and then providing support groups and educational forums for people to get connected. And of course, Cancer Connections is exactly one of those types of groups, because a lot of hospital systems don't necessarily have the resources to be able to put on educational events and cooking classes and organizing support groups where people can really come and get connected, which is critically important. All of this is brought under a consultation with an integrative oncologist with the ultimate goal of optimal health and healing, which will lead to improved outcomes. So one of the biggest struggles that we have within the center is trying to get people to understand that there are potent anti-cancer phytochemicals in the food that we eat. Most people will come in and they will have often these potent phytochemicals like curcumin in a bottle. They will have the extract from broccoli or from tomatoes in a pill. And they're consuming these pills instead of turning to the whole food. And there actually isn't a lot of evidence that the extract from a lot of these healthy foods that we think, in theory, should be more potent because you're taking out the active medical ingredient. And we know for a lot of pharmaceuticals in our country that are commonly used, we did extract the active ingredient, for example, from willow bark to make aspirin. This actually hasn't turned out to be very positive in the world of cancer prevention, that if you take this active ingredient from the plant world or this supplement, for example, selenium to prevent prostate cancer, it hasn't turned out to be that useful. And in many cases, it's actually led to the development of cancer. So we really try and get patients to focus on whole food as part of their diet. and steering them away from unhealthy foods to foods that we know are really going to be healthy. So a lot of the information that we have on this comes from these large epidemiological observational studies. So here's one, for example, that was just published at the end of 2012, looking at over 100,000 individuals and comparing different diets and their risk of getting cancer. And so here we can see, comparing people who are primarily vegetarian to non-vegetarians, there's a reduced risk of getting cancer for vegetarians, even more so for those who classify themselves as vegan. And this effect was even stronger for female-based cancers. Now, after you're diagnosed with cancer, this is data that represents women who are diagnosed with breast cancer and the relationship between having a recurrence of disease and their intake of vegetables. And again, we see that as the intake of vegetables go up in the diet, the risk of having a recurrence goes down. Cynthia Thompson was particularly interested in trying to understand, is there a particular component, is there a particular kind of vegetable that's going to be the most protective? And she looked at just cruciferous vegetables. And we see that the women actually who were on tamoxifen, so meaning they have the estrogen receptor positive cancer, which is the most common kind of breast cancer, that their risk was reduced compared to women not eating the high amount of cruciferous vegetable. So the message from this slide is, if you were diagnosed and treated for breast cancer, just start consuming large amounts of cruciferous vegetables, and that's going to be the most important thing. But she took it one step further, and then she looked at overall vegetable intake in individuals who already had the high cruciferous vegetable intake, and their risk was reduced even more. So it's not just about one particular vegetable, it's about increasing the variety and increasing the quantity. Their risk was cut in half for high cruciferous vegetable intake and high overall vegetable intake. Well, let me talk a little bit about what cancer is. And cancer is a disease of the genes. It's not always a disease of the genes as we think about it as something that you inherit, but is a disease of inappropriate gene regulation, and in particular, inappropriate gene expression. The minority of cancers, 5 to 10%, would be classified as strictly hereditary, meaning that it's passed down from one individual to another through gene mutations. One of those, however, is in women who have the BRCA1 gene mutation. These women are typically told they have an 80% chance of getting breast cancer by the age of 80. Those are pretty bad statistics, and many women will undergo a double mastectomy to avoid having to be diagnosed with breast cancer. This data would suggest that the individual's fate is not written in stone just because they have the BRCA1 mutation. And in fact, women, as you can see here, who consume the largest variety and quantity of vegetables had a reduced risk of developing breast cancer compared to the minimal. And in fact, the small and the moderate consumption group fell in that intermediate range, what we would call in medicine a dose-response relationship. Men who have a genetic mutation on the COX-2 regulatory gene have more than a 5-fold increased risk of getting prostate cancer. COX-2 is an inflammatory pathway, and we know many cancers, including prostate cancer, colon cancer, lung cancer, is related to inflammation. In particular, it is being studied, this COX-2 inflammatory pathway. Men who have a mutation on the COX-2 inflammatory pathway and consume fish on a regular basis, their risk totally disappeared. It's as if they didn't have that gene mutation. So from some of these emerging studies, we see the diet is actually having an impact on gene expression and gene regulation, which is critically important in your risk for cancer and influencing outcomes once you're diagnosed with cancer. So this is really what we would call a depiction of the anti-cancer plate, which of course is the antithesis of the typical American diet. This is primarily a plant-based diet. You see a lot of colors in this plant-based diet. It's not to the exclusion of animal products, but the animal products need to be from healthy animals. We know that omega-6 fatty acids from omega-3 fatty acids from seafood, and in particular the cold water fish, will be very healthy. Eating beef from healthy animals in moderation is something that can be on this plate, but it needs to be in the right quantities. And the USDA now has come out with better recommendations than they have in the past on what the American diet should be. And they say that at least 3/4 of our plate, the physical plate, should be made up of fruits, vegetables, and grains, and preferentially whole grains. So the refined grains, the white sugar, and white flour, of course, will be spiking your glycemic load, which shoots up your insulin levels, and this can lead to inflammation. Of the other quarter of the plate that would be protein, half of that should be a plant-based protein. So that would mean that around 1/8 of the plate, it's permissible to be an animal-based protein. Well, when was the last time you went to a restaurant and ordered an average meal, and that 1/8 of the calories that you consumed were from an animal? Unless you're vegetarian and you specifically ordered that. But if you order fish, if you order beef, chicken, pork, if you order any animal protein, you're getting a 6 to 8 ounce piece of animal protein. That is way beyond 1/8 of your plate. So shifting our society to really follow what the USDA guidelines are is going to be a challenge. But it takes everyone being part of this. And actually, when you get a 3-ounce steak or a 3-ounce piece of fish, realizing that that's the appropriate amount of protein for you to be having that evening. So let's shift and talk about physical activity. We know that people who are physically active live longer. This is recent data that looked at amount of physical activity. It's a somewhat complicated slide, but if you just look at here, these are the people who are most physically active and their risk of all-cause mortality compared to the people who are never physically active. And the ones who are never physically active overall have the highest risk of death. Within each of these categories, they then looked at the amount of television viewing from less than 1 hour a day up to 7+ hours a day. So the people who had the highest risk of death, of course, are the people who were never active and were watching more than 7 hours a day. But even down here, where you see individuals who are the most physically active, television viewing and sedentary behavior still had an impact on survival. So this would suggest that it is not just about going out to the gym, doing your hour burst of physical activity and thinking that everything is going to be fine because you're physically active, but we need to be active throughout the day. And you can't just, when you get home, sit down for 6 hours straight, that you need to be moving around. Again, if we look at who we are evolutionarily, for 58.5 minutes, we weren't sitting down and watching television. We weren't sitting at computers as we are now, just in the last fraction of the time of human beings on this planet. We were always moving around for the majority of our time that we've been on this planet. And this has been something that is dramatically changed in really the past 100 years. Well, here's the risk of developing breast cancer as it relates to exercise. And we see that the most active women have a lower risk of developing breast cancer compared to the least active women. After a diagnosis and treatment of cancer, we see the women who fall into this moderate level of physical activity have a reduced risk compared to the women who are the least active. And what's somewhat comforting is that these more elite athletes aren't necessarily any more protective than just this moderate amount of physical activity. So what does that mean? That means probably 30 to 45 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity 5 to 6 days a week. What can happen is what's called chromosomal instability, and then as the cells replicate, if they have chromosomal instability, this can lead to mutations. And of course, this can, if not checked by other systems in the body, it can lead to cancer. And so chromosomal instability through telomere shortening is one risk for cancer, and this is something that's actually investigated as a way to treat cancer, making sure that the telomeres remain healthy. Aging leads to shortening of the telomeres. This is something that we're not going to be able to avoid, and it is, you can actually measure telomere length as a representation of biological age. What we know from some very elegant research done by Elise Epple and Elizabeth Blackburn is that chronic stress leads to telomere shortening. So put in other words, chronic stress speeds the aging process. So we have a lot of individuals and a lot of investment from the pharmaceutical industry to find the fountain of youth, to reverse the aging process. Well, if we know what speeds the aging process, perhaps we should focus a little bit on that, which is managing stress in our lives. Now, when we try and understand the relationship between stress and cancer, this becomes much more problematic scientifically because it is not really ethical to take a group of individuals and chronically stress them and see how much cancer they develop compared to the group that you treat really nicely and give them a healthy life. But this is something that we can do to animals. And some very elegant research that was done at MD Anderson Cancer Center under the leadership of Anil Sood, who's a gynecologist, showed that chronic stress led to progression of ovarian cancer. And he was able to show that you could reverse this effect if you gave the animals propranolol, which is a very common beta blocker. And this beta blocker, propranolol, essentially blocks the stress hormone norepinephrine. So you take these chronically stressed mice and you block the stress hormone. Stress didn't have any effect on them. This was a study that was reproduced by Steve Cohen and his colleagues at UCLA, looking specifically at a metastatic breast cancer model. So these animals are injected with a breast cancer in the mammary pads, and then you look at the growth of the cancer over time. And here we can see, as a representation of the growth of this cancer in one of the animals that was being stressed. On day 24, you see metastatic disease in the lymph nodes. By day 28, you see disease in the lungs, in the lymph nodes. Looked at graphically, these are the control animals and the amount of metastatic disease they have. They have no metastatic disease in those first 28 days. And look at the amount of metastatic disease that are in the stressed animals. All the stressed animals are getting metastatic disease in this first 28-day period of time. And what's interesting is that the primary tumor is growing slowly in both the animals, in both groups, stress and control. Primary tumors isn't what kills patients. It's the metastatic disease. And this is really the focus of oncology, is to try and control metastatic growth. You give these stressed animals a beta blocker, propranolol, the effects of stress totally disappear. So this led investigators at MD Anderson, as well as a hospital in Israel, to go and look at their database of breast cancer patients and compare the women who happened to be taking propranolol for hypertension or other cardiovascular disease-related issues. 2 women matched for all the medical characteristics, and looked at who had a recurrence of disease and who lived longer. And in fact, they found that women who were on propranolol had better outcomes. So this doesn't mean that all breast cancer patients should be going out and taking propranolol as a form of treatment, but it does suggest that there's something about the sympathetic nervous system, and in particular, the norepinephrine pathway, which surges during times of acute and chronic stress, and aspects of cancer growth. Well, we're very interested in my laboratory at looking in particular at depressive symptoms. And this is a common reaction, of course, to being diagnosed with a life-threatening illness. But it's something that we know now from a lot of evidence, including from my group, that if left unchecked, this can have an impact on survival. And so we were interested in looking at overall survival. These were all patients who had stage 4 kidney cancer, so very similar disease characteristics. And we looked not only at survival as it related to depression, but also inflammatory signaling by looking at how the genes were functioning. And so we can see from these survival curves that the patients who scored in the clinical range for depression didn't live as long. And they also had a dysregulation of inflammatory markers, dysregulation in the genes that control apoptosis, upregulation in the genes that cause inflammation in the body. So we're starting to have now a much better understanding of the relationship between negative emotional well-being, biology, and of course clinical outcomes. Susan Lukendorf, a wonderful colleague at the University of Iowa who also works with Anil Sood, was looking at the flip side of this in ovarian cancer patients and looking at this concept of social well-being and social integration as it related to survival in ovarian cancer patients. And here, finding this clear relationship between those who had high social attachment living longer compared to women who had low social attachment. And she also found that ovarian cancer patients who scored higher in social well-being at the time of surgery had lower levels of norepinephrine at the tumor site. As I described to you earlier, norepinephrine in animal models was driving progression of disease. Social well-being going high led to lower levels of norepinephrine. Again, these are observational studies, and association does not determine causation, but there's a clear story that's starting to emerge around the relationship that we have with stressors in our environment, how we react to them, how we process them, of course, first and foremost in our brain, and then having a direct influence right into the tumor microenvironment. We know that stress influences the immune system, that it has an influence directly on cancer cells, has an influence on the vascularization of the cancer itself. So people who have higher stress have a higher vascularization of the cancer, which of course helps to keep the cancer alive. And there are so many things that we can do in the area of mind-body medicine to help individuals manage the stress of diagnosis and treatment of cancer. A lot of these come from the conventional world, cognitive behavioral therapy, psychotherapy, relaxation, etc. And then also from complementary medicine treatments such as yoga, tai chi, qigong, meditation, etc. So the thing that's critically important is that people engage in something and engage in a daily practice. At MD Anderson, we have a lot of ongoing research in this area in particular of mind-body practices. This is my area of expertise and research with my colleague Alejandro Chaul and others, looking at different kinds of yoga integrated into the treatment plan for breast cancer patients, a qigong study we recently finished for prostate cancer patients, and others, focusing on trying to buffer the stress and the symptoms that patients may be experiencing from their treatments, as well as using these types of modalities as an actual treatment. For example, a very common side effect of chemotherapy is what we call chemobrain or chemofog, essentially cognitive dysfunction due to the neurotoxic effects of the chemotherapy. And for some individuals, this of course can be chronic and extremely problematic for engaging in daily life and getting back to work. Well, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that meditation will result in neuroplasticity, meaning the formation of new neurons and new brain cells. And specifically, it's known that meditation can impact the same regions in a positive way that are damaged due to chemotherapy. So we're looking at meditation as a direct treatment for something like chemobrain. We have a huge interest in looking at acupuncture to help with symptom control, both in the prevention of many symptoms due to cancer treatments, as well as to improve outcomes in individuals who are experiencing a lot of side effects due to treatment. And so the most evidence actually exists for the control of nausea and vomiting due to chemotherapy, due to anesthesia, mounting evidence in the area of pain control, a number of well-done positive studies. We're also very interested in what's called xerostomia, so chronic dry mouth due to radiation of the head and neck, where we're finding some very positive studies in that area. And then the last area is investigating natural products. My colleague, Dr. Pei-Ying Yang's laboratory focuses specifically on looking at different plants, different natural products from the animal world, trying to understand if they are useful, initially, of course, in cells and then in animals, and where things are fruitful, moving them ultimately into clinical trials. So what I've tried to share with you tonight is information that there's so many things that we can do to help prevent cancer and to help control cancer once one is diagnosed with cancer. And of course, this is focusing on improving nutrition, reducing sedentary behavior, reducing obesity, and reducing stress, and increasing social support in one's life and social integration. As I described to you from the research I'm doing, and the majority of research that's being done around the country, it's very reductionistic in nature. We're looking at yoga for breast cancer patients. We're looking at an oleander product to decrease side effects of chemotherapy for lung cancer patients. We're looking at acupuncture to treat dry mouth. So the question is, what happens when you start taking a more comprehensive approach? What would happen if we were to do a scientific research study, if people followed the whole prescription of what we recommend within our clinical center? Well, this is data that looked at, and I believe this was more than 100,000 individuals, whether they were following the American Cancer Society guidelines for cancer prevention. And they have 8 guidelines, and I reviewed a lot of those with you tonight: consuming a large amount of fruits and vegetables, reducing red meat intake, being physically active, being as lean as possible without being underweight, not smoking, etc. And we can see here that the more guidelines an individual is following, the lower their risk of death. And it's a stepped approach, that the people who are following 3 guidelines have a reduced risk compared to 0 or 2. The people following 7 to 8 have an even more reduced risk. This was very interesting and potentially one of the most important slides that represents the challenge to physicians in this area and all of us in the field of healthcare, which is everything that I've showed you up until now would make you say, well, this is obvious. Why didn't my doctor tell me after I had cancer that I need to change my diet and be physically active and manage my stress? And the reason is because the majority of clinical trials have focused on one component. And this is an example of one of those trials. It was called the WELL study, the Healthy Eating and Living study. And Cynthia Thompson, the data that I presented to you earlier about breast cancer patients and cruciferous vegetables, was part of this study. And they found a relatively modest benefit for increasing fruit and vegetable consumption. And they were actually comparing the standard recommendation of 5 servings a day to an enhanced recommendation of 9 servings a day. Well, 5 servings a day is not what the average American eats. They're eating 2 to 3 at the most. And so in some sense, they were comparing something that was an enhanced intervention already for their control group compared to the super enhanced of 9. And again, they did find some modest benefits, but nowhere near what they were expecting and nowhere near what one would expect based on the epidemiological data. But what this slide represents is a retrospective analysis of all the patients in the study, looking at the 2 behaviors of change in fruit and vegetable consumption and change in physical activity. And so let me just walk you through this, where you see the gray line there represents the risk of death over time from breast cancer for the women who had low fruit and vegetable consumption and low physical activity. Then the yellow line represents women who increased their vegetable and fruit consumption but didn't really change their physical activity. There's no difference. So if you ask a doctor who looks at this graph, you know, should I increase my fruit and vegetable consumption? They'd say, well, no, because it doesn't make a difference. Eat whatever you want. It's irrelevant. Now, the red line represents the women who didn't really increase their fruit and vegetable consumption, but increased their physical activity. And again, we see, you know, maybe this hint early on there could be a difference, but really not meaningful. And by year 5 and 6, the lines are all overlapping. Should I increase my physical activity, doctor? Well, no, there's no real benefit. But that blue line that you've probably been looking at are the women who increase their physical activity and their fruit and vegetable consumption. Here we see a significant improvement in survival. And so there's something going on synergistically, and nobody has really started to look at this yet. One study done by Barbara Anderson out of Ohio State University randomized 227 breast cancer patients who all had stage 2 or 3 disease, so not as favorable a risk relative to women who had stage 1 disease. And they were randomized either to a comprehensive lifestyle change study, support groups where they learned about diet, they learned about physical activity, they learned about healthy relationships, etc., compared to a group that were just given standard pamphlets and information from the American Cancer Society. And the primary outcome was recurrence of disease that you see pictured here. The dark line represents the survival of the women who received that intervention. 60% difference in survival. If this was a chemotherapeutic agent, it would be on the cover of every single newspaper. Most oncologists have never heard of this study. And these survival curves are things that they dream of with the chemotherapies that they're working with. This is death from breast cancer, and this is overall survival. Staggering differences between the intervention and the control group. There were 62 women who overall had a recurrence of disease. And if we look at their survival from the time they had a recurrence, whether they were in the intervention group or the control group, we see these differences. So for some of these women, this was years before when they had had exposure to this intensive educational intervention on lifestyle changes and how that could be helpful to them. So this is an area that we're really starting to focus on scientifically. And about 3 to 4 years ago, I met David Servan-Schreiber when we invited him to MD Anderson to give a talk. And we became very close friends and colleagues at that time. He's written this wonderful book called AntiCancer, A New Way of Life. For those of you who haven't read this book, whether you have a personal experience with cancer or not, this is a wonderful resource that really outlines a lot of the evidence, some of which, of course, I presented to you this evening. He's written a subsequent book just before he died a year and a half ago, which is called Not the Last Goodbye, which is really a touching book that discusses his thoughts, emotions, feelings at the end of his life, but also how important it is to engage in what I view as all three components that I've outlined to you tonight. So engaging for me, in particular, in the dietary changes was relatively easy. You every day have to make a choice of what you're going to eat. And you can choose to eat the unhealthy food or make the right choice and eat the healthy food. Physical activity, we don't have to be physically active, although at some point you need to get up and out of bed and get to your work or get somewhere. So physical activity is something that we tend to engage in. And stress management is always shortchanged. And David, in his book, talks about how critically important the concept of finding calm in one's life is, and trying to engage in a daily meditation or a daily practice that brings you calm, whatever that may be. And so in teaming up with David, actually the night after his lecture, we made a decision that we were going to raise the necessary funds to do a clinical trial of what we're calling comprehensive lifestyle change. And what has been wonderful is not only the amount of donations that came in to support this study, but that it came from literally across the country and across the world. Donations from almost every state of the United States and many provinces of Canada, as well as many countries. And so, of course, looking at this comprehensive model could be relevant, as we call it, across the cancer care continuum, from initially preventing disease in the first place to working with individuals who may be diagnosed with cancer, like some of the wonderful work of Dean Ornish working with prostate cancer patients who have chosen to undergo active surveillance and looking at how comprehensive lifestyle change may control the disease or even reverse it. And then, of course, patients who are undergoing active treatment. And where we've chosen to start is with specifically stage 3 breast cancer patients who are starting the phase of undergoing radiotherapy, and do very intensive training of these individuals during that period of time, and then staying tethered with them throughout the year to encourage the continued change, which of course is necessary, not just the New Year's resolution, but you need to keep it up month after month and ultimately year after year to produce that dramatic change. Now, something very important in closing is that we shouldn't be engaging in these lifestyle changes out of fear that we're going to get a disease, out of fear that we're not going to live as long once we have a disease, but that at the end of the day, you will feel better, that you are a happier person. There was just a study published last week that looked at the relationship between vegetable intake and happiness. Vegetable intake and depression. And people who eat more vegetables, they concluded, again from these observational studies, was a randomized trial, the people who are eating more vegetables are just happier people. So, you know, if nothing else, we need to be engaging in healthy lifestyle so that we just feel better. And if you feel better, you're a happier person. You're a happier neighbor, you're a happier spouse, you're a happier parent. The best is when you have happier children, which makes all of our lives easier. And so ultimately, at the end of the day, it's about fostering our own joy, our own health, and what's healthy for us as an individual ends up being healthy for our nation and ultimately healthy for the world. I thank you all for coming out tonight, making this first step in your own health, getting educated in this type of area, and I encourage you to get connected and work with Cancer Connections on their journey. Thank you.
Questions?
Sure.
We do have some water there. I'll announce that and turn this on.
So I'm happy to answer some questions. I believe there was some cards that were passed out, or and you can.
Just going to see if anybody in the audience has questions, since we didn't gather up your cards. So I will bring.
On an amplified one. There's many studies about genetically modified organisms and their effect on the occurrence of cancer.
So the question was about genetically modified foods. This isn't something that we're specifically studying, and it's an extremely controversial topic. It hasn't been studied at a large epidemiological level yet, but I did stumble across a very provocative study that was published last summer, coming out of a laboratory in France, that took a group of animals and half of them ate genetically modified corn and the other half ate regular corn. The animals that ate genetically modified corn had bodies that were riddled with cancer, organ failure, etc. And it wasn't that they were fed, mass quantities of these genetically modified organisms. However, with that said, this is a small animal study, and how that translates into humans is unknown. And to date, there hasn't been this direct causal relationship that can be determined, but it is something that's continuing to be investigated.
What can you tell us about melanoma, fighting melanoma?
Melanoma, in what sense?
Cancer.
Right, but melanoma is a disease of the skin that is the most...
It's gone inside of this person. So it's in the brain and in the lungs.
Well, so melanoma originally starts as a skin cancer, the most deadly form of skin cancer that, of course, can metastasize. What's interesting in terms of the conventional world is some of the biggest discoveries in cancer medicine in the past decade have been in the control of stage 4 melanoma. And for some, it's actually been quite miraculous chronic remissions that have been found. So beyond that, I don't have, one of the biggest risks of getting melanoma is early childhood excessive exposure to the sun. So that's something that is critically important from the prevention perspective of sun protection, particularly up in the early years prior to 20 years old, but also throughout life.
Have you studied neuropathy in the hands and feet from chemo? And if so, is there any recommended treatment?
So great question. So neuropathy is something that's a very unfortunate and common side effect of chemotherapy, pain and tingling in the periphery. We have ongoing research specifically looking at acupuncture for the treatment of neuropathy, and have found in single-arm studies, meaning without a control group, that we're seeing improvement in symptoms. And we're now embarking on some randomized trials. We're also doing some research looking at what's called neurofeedback. So this is typically used for ADHD, and there's been some evidence with some other chronic pain conditions that if you map the brain and see where there is what you could call inappropriate brain signaling, that through neurofeedback, which is literally like biofeedback, and you can change that electrical activity in that brain region, that you could decrease pain. So we have an ongoing study looking at neurofeedback, and at least just what we're seeing anecdotally from the patients is a tremendous improvement in their symptoms. So both, acupuncture as well as neurofeedback could be useful, but it's still preliminary in that area.
Yes, are you familiar with the iodine protocol and the treatment of tumors rather than doing conventional chemotherapy and radiation, and also prevention of recurrence?
So the question was about the iodine protocol. I'm not familiar with that. There's probably more things out there that people are more familiar with than I am, but that's one in particular I haven't heard of.
So I was curious, what are the major pro-inflammatory foods other than processed foods?
So the question was about pro-inflammatory foods. The oils, as I was describing in our diet, can be pro-inflammatory. So, by and large, what our recommendations are in terms of oil is either canola oil or olive oil in terms of being healthy oils. Having, again, these animal products that are in some sense in and of themselves unhealthy is going to be leading to inflammation in the body. And so what we, again, really try and focus on with our patients is the foods that are anti-inflammatory in nature. And by and large, an inflammatory food is sugar. An inflammatory food is white flour. So the food, in some sense, in and of themselves, isn't inflammatory, but what it's happening in the body. If you have the spike in glucose levels in the body, you're going to be having a spike in insulin, which leads to inflammation. And if it's the spike in insulin, so it's not necessarily the food in and of itself, but it's what the food is doing in our body. And it, of course, gets more complicated because if you follow the diabetic diet recommendations, you're actually going to be always trying to have protein along with the carbohydrate, which helps to decrease that insulin spike. And so having a big glass of orange juice and a fruit cup and a sugar-filled yogurt for breakfast is going to just wreak havoc on your insulin levels. If you were to throw in a dozen nuts with that same breakfast, it would help to decrease that insulin peak.
You said less beef protein, more plant protein. What would be some examples of what do you think about supplements like whey protein?
Well, I'm not a dietitian or nutritionist by profession. My focus is in the area of mind-body. But I think it's ideal to get your proteins from whole foods. So eating supplements, eating these processed foods, eating whole soy is something that's going to be really healthy. Eating soy powders and soy substitutes in all of our foods may not be so healthy. So the ideal source for plant-based proteins, of course, is all the beans, all the legumes, and of course the wonderful nuts that are available to us as sources of very healthy proteins. And the variety, some people will say to me, well, how can you be a vegetarian? That must be so boring. It's actually the opposite of boring. If I were to be primarily a meat eater, that I view as relatively boring because you have this 8-ounce piece of steak and that's the majority of your caloric intake, maybe a little bit of broccoli, versus having 4 different beans and 6 different vegetables all cooked in different ways with different spices. The variety is endless if you embrace a vegetarian diet.
We're going to do more questions, but before so many of you may have to leave. I want to just say a couple of things. One, again, thank you so much for coming. Secondly, one of the things that was on your chair is an evaluation form. Those are just critical to us meeting your needs for future educational programs, and we sure would like for you to fill that out, and you can just leave it on your chair. Finally, in case you have been moved to be a founder of the Cancer Connection Idaho, there's also an envelope on your chair and a box over on this table here that you could put cash or a check or whatever. If you would rather use a credit card, we have that available at the bar in the back. And finally, if you have a lovely home that you would like to donate to us tonight, we would be glad to talk with you. Anybody with the name tag. Maybe that's not finally. Maybe finally, if you'd be interested in negotiating for your firstborn child, we could figure out some way to do that too. It's been a pleasure having you, but again, we're going to go back to questions, and I know a lady who's been waiting right back here.
You mentioned in one of the studies that social attachment was a factor in decreasing either the incidence or risk of cancer. And I was wondering if you could say a bit about how social attachment is defined and why and how it decreases the risk or incidence.
Well, the question was about social attachment and risk of cancer. The study I described was actually social attachment and what you could say is progression of disease or risk of death after diagnosis of ovarian cancer in the women who were more socially integrated and had better social attachment, had better outcomes. And this is essentially measured with self-report instruments, asking people to report on the number and the quality of social relationships that they have. And so the question is, how can something like social support have an impact on survival? And it's a very good question and not one for which we have very clear answers. But there's a number of different pathways whereby social integration can influence health outcomes. One, because you have individuals from a tangible perspective who are there to help you. So they're there to help you do things in your life in some sense. They can go shopping for you, they can take you to the hospital, they can help you in this more tangible way. Then of course there's emotional support, somebody who you can share your thoughts, your feelings, your fears with. And this, we believe, of course, can be very helpful for, again, going back to the stress model, helping to buffer the stress that people may be experiencing when they become socially isolated, when they have a life-threatening illness. And there's good data, again, dating back to the 1950s, published in very good journals, showing that people who are in happy marriages live longer. And one reason, last pathway for this could also be because you have somebody else who is encouraging healthy behaviors in you. And there is evidence to suggest that a lot of healthy behaviors are contagious in a good way. And the flip side of that, of course, is that a lot of unhealthy behaviors are contagious in a negative way as well. So that when you as an individual make that change in your life, it'll affect everyone in your circle. So getting connected with people who are healthy will end up having you being a healthy individual as well.
I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about anti-angiogenesis and whether or not you feel it's been effective in reducing the incidence or risk for people developing cancer, or if people who are engaging in anti-angiogenetic behaviors are able to reduce the severity of their cancer.
So the question asking about anti-angiogenic agents from the conventional world. So angiogenesis is the process whereby cancer cells develop their own vascular system. Now that sounds really frightening, and Judah Folkman, who discovered this concept of angiogenesis, was actually ridiculed by the majority of the scientific world, and all his grants were turned down when he first tried to get funding, but it is now a definitive fact that cancer cells will develop their own vascular system to feed themselves, which of course is part of your body, but it's very strange that it's your body gone rogue. And so there's a lot of drugs that have been developed essentially to block angiogenesis, which are anti-angiogenic drugs. Some of them have proven to be useful, not as big an effect as one was expecting from the anti-angiogenic agents. They'll probably need to be combined with some of these other targeted therapies that are targeting other mutagenic pathways in the body based on different individual cancers. But interesting research has actually found a relationship between chronic stress and increasing vascular endothelial growth factor, is a product within the blood that drives angiogenesis. And so in Anil Sood's stressed ovarian cancer model, the chronically stressed animals had a significant increase in angiogenesis that was being driven again by the stress hormone norepinephrine. Give the animals a beta blocker and you blocked angiogenesis due to chronic stress.
You talked about the effect of sugars. The fact that we're using a high degree of our sugars now, high fructose corn syrup, is that a positive thing or a negative thing?
Well, high fructose corn syrup has gotten a lot of bad press, but I don't think that high fructose corn syrup is necessarily any more damaging than cane sugar. And we see now cane sugar is in everything, and somehow we think, and the producers of the food think, that we'll be tricked, and perhaps many people are, that, well, if it's cane sugar, well, that's natural. It's a natural sugar. I was told that high fructose corn syrup is bad. I don't see that on this ingredient, so now everything's going to be okay. It's probably no different. It's probably just as bad for you. And Coca-Cola, and I can't pick on Coca-Cola particularly since they're filming, but also the industries are shifting away from high fructose corn syrup, and they're saying we're going to just use natural sugar. We're going to use cane sugar, and there's probably no difference. It's probably going to cause the same damage in our body, lead to obesity, lead to inflammation, etc. So it's really focusing on balancing your glycemic load in your diet, which is going beyond actually just the concept of added sugars, and it's looking at the balance of the kind of food that you're eating. So white bread, white potato, white flour, a lot of white is not going to be good for you, and we need to be incorporating more colors, in particular brown and red and green and yellow. One last question.
Dr. Cohen, thank you very much for a very enlightening presentation. Some of the data you showed early in your talk indicates that there's a significant difference between a vegetarian and a vegan diet. And the transition for many people might be difficult. It also implies that it's dairy products, I think, that is the major difference between those forms of, those two dietary patterns. Can you comment on the mechanism? And I think the China study is somewhat controversial, but my understanding is that it kind of points at dietary sources of protein and other components. So maybe you could enlighten us about that as well. Thank you.
Great question. So for the next hour, I will talk to you about the dairy industry. This is a great question in a really controversial area for which there are many differing opinions out there. So that data that I showed you about vegetarian versus vegan versus non-vegetarian is relatively recent. I mean, it was literally published in December. And there isn't a lot looking at veganism per se, and this is something that's going to start increasing. The China study puts out a premise that the casein that is in dairy is something that can be, when combined with other exposures to mutagens, that can be cancer causing. And then the flip side of actually looking at, in experimental models, the removal of dairy products leading to better outcomes. For prostate cancer, there is a number of studies now that have found a risk between exposure to dairy and risk of developing prostate cancer. For some other cancers, there isn't as clear a link. Of course, as men, this is something that needs to be thought about seriously because it is the #1 cancer in men, and it is something that is not a very common cancer in Asia that consume very little dairy products. So the switch from vegetarian to vegan is pretty dramatic, and I personally don't espouse that because, again, the evidence isn't there. But I will describe to you what Walter Willett's opinion is. Dr. Walter Willett is the chair of the School of Public Health at Harvard University, and he was in MD Anderson and at Baylor College of Medicine a couple of years ago. And when he was at MD Anderson, he gave a talk on diet, on lifestyle, and in particular this area of obesity and cancer risk. When he was at the Children's Nutrition Group at Baylor, he gave an anti-dairy and anti-milk talk. It was so vehemently against dairy products and the evidence that's emerging on how there is nothing really healthy in milk, and laying forward, of course, the premise that we are the only species on the planet that drinks milk after weaning, let alone the fact that we're drinking the milk from a different species. I mean, when you think about what we're doing, it's actually quite strange. And of course, historically, it's not that, we were chasing, the mastodons on the fields and milking them for the 58.5 minutes that we were not an agricultural society. It's only in a very short period of time that we've been consuming dairy products in the massive amounts that we're consuming. And Dr. Willett actually described that the dietary recommendation panel that he sat on, which was charged with coming up with dietary recommendations to achieve all the nutritional needs that we have for vitamins and minerals from whole foods. They came to the end of this meeting and they realized that they were short on potassium. And it's hard to know why they were short on potassium. You would think, well, why didn't you just throw in a banana or two? But they didn't pick on just one particular fruit or vegetable. And somebody said, well, let's just say 2 glasses of milk a day and we can call the meeting adjourned and that'll give people enough potassium. And so people voted on it, and 2 cups of milk a day for potassium. Well, how many people in the room think the recommendation for 2 cups a day has anything to do with potassium? Right? We all think of calcium. Well, you can get calcium from a lot of different things in your diet. It doesn't need to necessarily come from milk. So there's huge proponents out there saying that dairy should not be on the USDA recommendations after, of course, individuals have surpassed 5 or 6 years of age. Again, I'm not saying that that's what I espouse, but it is something very controversial. And there are, of course, other very healthy sources for protein and for calcium, which, of course, come from milk. So there is a lot of information out there on the internet. What's wonderful is you can, for example, Google Walter Willett's name and you can see his thoughts on milk on YouTube. You can Google Dean Ornish's name and see the wonderful work that he's doing. So I encourage all of you to go out and get educated in this area, get healthy, stay active, and manage your stress and be socially connected. Thank you.